city does not fall in a single day. Neither does the meaning of its words. In Corcyra, before the killings, before the purges, something quieter happened first. Speech itself began to rot. Words once tied to virtue were twisted to suit fear and faction. Thucydides didn't dramatize it. He named it plainly. Words had to change their ordinary meaning and to take that which was now given them. Justice no longer meant fairness. It meant revenge in service of your own. Loyalty was no longer faithfulness to the city, but blind obedience to your side. Moderation became cowardice. Caution became betrayal. This kind of inversion is not noise. It is silence because nothing can be clearly said anymore. And once that happens, judgment dies. What follows is not chaos. It's something worse. Order without morality, built on words that sound familiar but mean nothing. That is how the fall begins. Corcyra was a jewel of the Ionian Sea. Rich harbors, thick-walled citadels, and shipyards that could outbuild most mainland cities. Trade winds brought grain, wine, and rumor, especially rumor. By the 5th year of the Peloponnesian War, the city's prosperity felt less like security and more like provocation. Everyone wanted a piece of Corcyra, including its own citizens. The ruling elites spoke of prudence, tradition, and strategic alliance with Corinth. They believed restraint preserved the city. But others, rowers, craftsmen, and small farmers, saw in Athens a model of possibility, a democracy powered by those who had once been overlooked. Each side claimed to defend Corcyra, but their definitions of the city diverged. And with that divergence came a new vocabulary. Words that once united began to fracture. Preservation to one faction meant loyalty to old treaties. To the other, it meant severing those very ties. The same term could signal patriotism or treason depending on who used it and who heard it. Tensions escalated when a wave of refugees from nearby Epidamnus arrived, straining food and trust. A council debate on aid devolved into accusation. The newcomers were called kin by some, infiltrators by others. From that point, no word came without suspicion. Propaganda surfaced across the city. Common speech was redefined. Foresight became conspiracy. Moderation became betrayal. Silence became confession. Guards began interrogating not identities but beliefs. A single phrase could betray your allegiance. A single hesitation could cost your life. The first victims were not generals or known agitators, but moderates, those who resisted taking sides. They were labeled as hesitant, as threats to purity. Their deaths marked a turning point. Conversation itself was now dangerous. Corcyra's collapse came not in a single battle, but in a slow linguistic erosion. By the time blood reached the stones of the public square, the truth had already died in whispered slogans, in corrupted meanings, in the quiet approval of those who let it happen. Language doesn't just describe reality, it can manufacture it. Once Corcyra's factions learned this, words became more than tools of persuasion. They became instruments of control. At first, this shift was subtle. Accusations wrapped in moral language, adjectives doing more harm than verbs. But soon it escalated. Rhetoric turned into rules, labels hardened into sentences. If someone called you a traitor, you had to prove otherwise, not with evidence, but with allegiance. Say the wrong word, hesitate at the wrong moment, and you were guilty by tone alone. This weaponization wasn't chaotic, it was calculated. Both sides trained their followers in how to speak, what to say, and which phrases to distrust. Ordinary language was filtered through partisan suspicion. Even silence could be treason. Soon, speaking plainly was seen as naive. Everyone learned to hedge, to mirror, to echo the slogans of their group. People spoke not to communicate, but to survive. The cost was enormous. Once language becomes camouflage, nothing honest can breathe. Jokes disappear. Confessions vanish. Even love, if ever spoken, must be coded, cautious, politically correct. This is the quiet violence of word warfare. It doesn't burn buildings, but it empties voices. And in that silence, the worst ideas walk free, unchallenged and unnamed. The more language lost its shape in Corcyra, the more identity became a matter of performance. Once speech was politicized, people were no longer evaluated by their actions, but by their phrasing, their tempo, even their hesitation. No one needed to denounce you. You could be condemned by using the wrong word at the wrong time. A cautious phrase meant disloyalty. A joke out of step meant betrayal. Not cheering loudly enough was interpreted as veiled dissent, and silence, formerly a space for thought, became its own kind of guilt. Over time, social life hardened into ritual. Conversations became tests, friendships became auditions. Every sentence needed to signal which side you stood on. Every pause had a cost. People didn't speak to connect, they spoke to survive. Children watched their parents rehearse acceptable phrases. Merchants chose slogans more carefully than wares. In temples, prayers were reworded to avoid misinterpretation. Even mourning required caution. Grieve the wrong victim and you were suspected. There were no public confessions in Corcyra, no inquisitions, no mass indoctrination campaigns. The genius of the collapse was that no one needed to be coerced. People simply adapted. Language had become a mirror, and in it, everyone saw the same fear. That to say nothing was safer than to say something that might be misunderstood. But that fear, multiplied across a city, creates something far worse than confusion. It creates obedience. And when people obey not because they agree, but because they cannot risk being seen as different, then speech is no longer free. It is scripted, and society, though still noisy, has already gone quiet inside. Meaning does not vanish all at once. It is corroded, gently, persistently, until the rust becomes the structure. In Corcyra, the redefinition of words did not occur in back rooms. It happened in daylight, in the mouths of orators, in the chants of citizens. And with each shift, something crucial was lost: the ability to hold one another accountable in terms everyone still recognized. When justice meant vengeance, who could claim injustice? When loyalty meant obedience to a faction, who could claim betrayal? When truth was recast as perspective, who could be caught lying? Those who sought power understood this well. They saw ambiguity not as a threat to stability, but as a resource. If language no longer had fixed points, then authority could move its definitions at will, always in its favor. To dissent was not just dangerous, it was linguistically impossible. You couldn't resist something you couldn't name. The marketplace of ideas turned into a theater of compliance. People didn't speak to express, they performed to conform. Even in private, vocabulary narrowed. The lexicon of loyalty replaced the grammar of conscience. In this atmosphere, resistance died not with violence, but with exhaustion. Clarity was too costly, precision too risky. Even thinking differently became burdensome, because it required you to mentally translate what others now meant by old words. And so the city did not fall because it lacked institutions. It fell because those institutions still spoke, but their words no longer meant anything. This was not the collapse of politics, it was the collapse of possibility. Corcyra is ancient, but its pattern is not. Today we see the same distortions, more subtle, more digital, but no less corrosive. Words that were once shared, freedom, truth, justice, patriotism, have become fractured. Each side in a debate uses them, but they no longer mean the same thing. Freedom can mean personal liberty or the right to harm others in the name of that liberty. Justice can mean accountability or vengeance dressed up in moral code. Truth is often replaced by your truth and my truth, as if reality were customizable. This is not a natural evolution of language. It is a collapse of agreement, a loss of common reference points. And when that happens, democracy, conversation, compromise, persuasion stops working. The internet makes things worse. Online, language bends faster than in the street. Memes replace arguments. Headlines replace articles. Outrage becomes a currency. Algorithms favor sharpness over accuracy, tribalism over clarity. What Corcyra suffered through slowly, we now experience at the speed of refresh. We've learned to speak in signals, not to think together, but to declare what team we're on. A word can become dangerous if used without quotation marks or qualifiers. People self-censor not out of care, but out of fear. Not wanting to be misunderstood becomes the same as not wanting to speak, and silence, once a sign of thoughtfulness, becomes guilt. The room we once had to figure out what we believe has shrunk. Like Corcyra, we are building a society where meaning is manipulated and moral clarity outsourced to whatever narrative is trending. And like Corcyra, we may only realize the damage when it's too late to speak clearly at all. Because when words break down, people follow. By the time Corcyra's language had turned to dust, the institutions followed, but not with fire, with applause. The courts still functioned, but only to formalize vengeance. Trials became performances. Outcomes were known in advance, staged with legal dignity but hollow of justice. The assembly still met, but instead of debate, it echoed. Whoever shouted loudest controlled the room. Arguments shrank into slogans. Decisions were made not by weighing options, but by gauging which choice would avoid punishment tomorrow. Laws were not repealed, they were reinterpreted. Old texts twisted to new meanings, precedent ignored in favor of political urgency. Even the sacred was not spared. Religious rituals became partisan events, used to prove loyalty rather than seek divine guidance. Neutrality became the most dangerous stance of all. To abstain from taking a side meant to declare yourself suspect to both. And so moderates, the city's last chance for balance, were the first to vanish. Not always killed, sometimes exiled, sometimes erased with silence. And through it all, the city kept functioning. Shops opened, markets bustled, citizens prayed. But beneath the surface, Corcyra was hollowed out. The forms of civilization remained, but their spirit had fled. The machinery of civic life does not need wisdom to turn. It only needs compliance. And in Corcyra, everyone learned to comply, not because they believed, but because they were tired. Corcyra did not disappear after the madness. It remained on the map, its walls still standing, its name still spoken in treaties and war reports. But its moral center had collapsed, and that collapse was irreversible. What had once been a city of trade and dialogue became a city of suspicion. Trust never returned. The wounds of the Civil War did not heal, they calcified. Even years later, when the Peloponnesian War moved elsewhere, Corcyra did not reclaim its soul. It had survived physically, but not spiritually. Families remembered who betrayed whom. Streets were renamed. Cemeteries whispered old loyalties. No one forgot, and so no one forgave. The next generation inherited not a city of hope, but of caution. Children were taught not how to live well, but how to avoid making enemies. And what of justice? What of reconciliation? There were no tribunals, no apologies, no grand symbolic gestures. Just the quiet continuation of a broken society, too tired to fix itself and too fractured to imagine anything different. Thucydides did not romanticize this end. He gave no hopeful conclusion, no phoenix from ashes, only the sobering truth that some collapses do not end with rubble, but with routine. A new normal shaped not by healing, but by numbness. And so Corcyra faded, not in ruins, but in memory. A city still standing, but emptied of meaning. We are not ancient. We do not live in stone cities, nor settle disputes in assemblies beneath olive trees. And yet, Corcyra finds us. In every echo chamber, in every online dog pile, in every misuse of once sacred words, truth, justice, freedom, we hear its voice. When language becomes a contest of tribes rather than a medium of understanding, we move closer. When words are twisted to serve ideology instead of reality, we take another step. When disagreement becomes grounds for exile and silence becomes guilt, we arrive at the edge. Today, the battlefield is digital, but the stakes are the same, the survival of meaning. And meaning, once lost, takes generations to rebuild. If we cannot speak together, we cannot think together. And if we cannot think together, we cannot live together. The warning of Corcyra is not just about violence. It is about the soil in which violence grows. Words that no longer connect but divide, laws that no longer bind but justify, and people who no longer listen but label. The descent begins not with swords, but with speech. It begins not with evil, but with exhaustion. To resist it, we must guard not just against falsehood, but against the erosion of meaning itself. Because the day truth dies is never loud. It is quiet, logical, justified. And by the time we realize it, we are already speaking a language we no longer understand. There is no rescue at the end of Corcyra's story, no sudden return to harmony, only the silence that follows when a society forgets how to mean what it says. But every silence contains the possibility of a voice. What we learn from Corcyra is not how to prevent all collapse, but how to notice its beginning. And it always begins the same way, with words that lose their grip on shared reality, with names that divide rather than define, with arguments that stop seeking truth and start rehearsing loyalty. The first crack is not a riot, it's a shrug. It's a citizen who hears distortion and thinks, maybe it's not worth the fight. But the fight is not for sides, it's for clarity, for precision, for the humility to say, I don't know, and the courage to say, but I want to understand. Recovery doesn't start with justice, or even forgiveness. It starts with a word, spoken plainly, without irony, without strategy. It starts with someone meaning what they say. Because when meaning returns, possibility returns, and in that possibility, even ruins can begin to speak again.